Hello, and welcome to the Culture Roundtable, brought to you by Culture in Sports, where culture is critical to long-term success. For the past 2 years, Culture in Sports has been educating and influencing organizations, teams, coaches, staff, and even athletes about the importance of culture and leadership in sports, as it greatly impacts organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long-term mental, physical, and emotional health. Leadership and organizational culture adversely or positively have a cost and impact to every organization's bottom line, not only with fans in the stands, concession sales, and merchandise sales, but broadcasting, advertising, and endorsement deals. We believe in our mantra, culture is critical for long-term success, and strive to promote this every day. Positively influencing others and educating sports organizations, front office and support staff, coaches and athletes on the impact in leadership and culture is what we work on daily. I'm your host, Jeremy Piasecki, and I'm also a panelist, and I'd like to introduce you to the Culture and Sports Roundtable. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss mistakes coaches make and do not have to. I would like to now introduce you to the special group of panelists. Maria Fatali. She's a professional football player. She's a running back for the Pittsburgh Passion, college athletics strength and conditioning coach, entrepreneur, and model. Dr. Carl Olson, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, former director of West Point Center for Enhanced Performance, former Penn State athletic director for performance psychology. Michael Chapman, he is of counsel with Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick, and his focus is on aiding national governing bodies as they work to maintain compliance with U.S. Center for Safe Sport policies. And Megan Liu. Megan is the founder and CEO of Strat and has an executive MBA from MIT. She leads a firm that specializes in helping leaders embark on and enable transformational change agendas. And I would like to also introduce you to today's moderator, Professor Robert Boland. Professor Boland is a Seton Hall Law School professor and counsel at Shoemaker Law Firm. He recently served as the Athletics Integrity Officer at Penn State University, previously director at Ohio University's highly ranked sports administration program, helped found New York University's Master's Sports and Business program, and served as academic chair of NYU's Tisch Center for Hospitality, Tourism, and Sports Management. He has more than 20 years of experience advising clients in matters involving sport, labor, antitrust, and criminal law, and representing players in contract negotiation across a variety of sports. Bob, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's far too generous an introduction of me, but I'm happy to be with this group because it really plays off of a situation that we've all worked with and that we're all hearing about so much. We're hearing about claims of coaching misconduct, coaching abuse, coaching mistakes, and coaching failure, whether it's the University of California swimming team with Terry McKeever being terminated as an Olympic level coach, a national champion level coach, whether we hear these things in sports at the end of seasons in basketball and other sports, whether we hear them in other sports like hockey, where Harvard's women's ice hockey coach is under investigation and review for a variety of practices. This is an important issue, and I don't think there's ever been a more fraught time to be a coach. What ideally is we're going to walk away from this session, hopefully, having talked to our audience as coaches, and with the exception of Maria, who is a strength and conditioning coach, we're not active coaches broadly. We're people who work closely with sports. We're people who work closely with coaches to create better culture, better opportunity. And it plays off things that we've talked about at Culture and Sports, the idea that coaches make a number of mistakes, but they don't have to. And part of the system of reaching to a system where you don't make mistakes is knowing where the pitfalls are in the road. So our conversation today, as investigators, as cultural changers, as counselors, as athletes, we want to share the perspective of how do we help coaches avoid some of the bad mistakes that we see some making, and what's the process for doing that? So I'm going to turn to the person that I probably know best on this panel, Carl Olson. And Carl, I've described you as a coach's best friend, the person who can, as a performance psychologist, help a coach reach a higher level of performance too, in addition to their team. And Carl, what are you seeing as the things coaches need in difficult and crisis situations? And I think just coaching in 2023 is a bit of a difficult and crisis situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. That we're at a point in our history now where there's more on a coach's plate than ever before, more expectations than ever before. And any coach that thinks that she or he can do it solo is mistaken. So I think one of the things that I saw over the last several years is the difference between coaches who recognize that no one person knows everything and the ones who feel that one person should know everything. And when I say one person can't know everything, there's a reason why we surround coaches in different organizations and to different degrees with resources, areas of expertise that it would be impossible for one person to actually have, advanced degrees or a ton of experience in every part of it, whether it's psychology, nutrition, the strength and conditioning, et cetera. All of these areas grew up out of academic disciplines with solid research behind them, and because there was a need to expand what's available to a coach and team. And I hear a lot people talking about these resources for athletes, and yes, absolutely. But the coach is the single most important leader of the organization. And when they embrace the idea of building partnerships and doing life together with people that have all these resources, it allows for them to reach out with vulnerability. And vulnerability, I mean, as openness, right? Open to the fact that you might want some perspective. And some of the best coaches that I saw during the pandemic, especially during the shutdown part, were ones who reached out and said, okay, now I may have been coaching for 20 or 30 or more years in my sport. There's something I don't know about how the 21st century student athlete thinks, processes, reacts, and so forth. Can you help me? Or on a more benign level, can you follow me around for a couple of days? This was before pandemic. Can you follow me around for a couple of days and give me feedback on how I can continue to grow as a coach? Those are some of the things that I think could be considered best practices, and everybody wins when there's partnerships in all this space.
That's a perfect scenario, and it leads me to the question I'm going to pose to Megan to bring her into this conversation. Tell us a little bit about your firm, Strat, and the work that you do in sports, and how that creates high-performing organizations and high-performing cultures.
Sure, thank you. At Strat, we believe in sound strategy and sound leadership as core levers of impacting culture or impacting positive cultures. And Carl, I couldn't agree with you more. Over the last couple of years in sport, in the world, our clients are absolutely seeing increased complexity, increased needs. The days are longer, the complexity is longer, or the complexity is more deep. And so oftentimes what we do when working with coaches, CEO, boards, in high performance situations is start with what you suggested. Listen. Don't go alone. Understand who your stakeholders are, understand their perspectives, take the time to ensure that you do have a good sense of needs. And I think that's oftentimes the pressure a leader feels. And I'm using the word leader, I think that's inherent in what a coach does, as a coach is a leader. And oftentimes you feel that pressure to be right. You've risen through the ranks because of your technical competency, and now you're in this spot and you must be right. And your point on vulnerability is really important, because I think it's a shift to say, I'm there to facilitate, I'm there to lead, and I need others to do that. And I need to understand what those others need. High performance folks, mental health folks, athletes, those above, those around. And so what we end up doing is helping that coach create a strategy and a process whereby they're able to listen and deeply hear about the needs within their organizations. We can get brought in times of crisis where something has happened, and the listening is really important as an agent in moving through trauma and conflict. We can get brought in the point of evolution where, the high performance outcomes aren't working and we need to think differently. But we do deeply believe that the first step in, strong culture building, in good leadership, is listening and knowing your stakeholders and listening to your stakeholders. I will say that the feedback is not always something you want to hear. And so I think it's really important to help coaches recognize themselves as leaders and to grow their leader muscle, in addition to their technical capacity. Helpful, Bob?
Thank you, Megan. I think very helpful. Maria, let's turn to you to bring an athlete's perspective to it, if you don't mind. You're wearing both hats a little bit, if we think so. But the idea is, like, from an athlete perspective, you've heard Carl talk a little bit about coaches and vulnerability. You've heard Megan talk a little bit about making the journey alone and taking input. How do you think that that's real today, and as both a coach and an athlete?
Yeah, so from an athlete perspective, I would say that a lot of coaches are taking that step of having a mentor or just continuously learning on how they can be better coaches and be better people to their athletes, which I think is good, because nobody's perfect and everybody can continue to grow, especially coaches. And like from a coach's perspective, as a strength coach, I'm kind of in a cool position because I don't necessarily have any say in the athletes' playing time, how much time they don't get. So my sole concern is them as a person and their performance. So I have a lot of effect on how they perform in the weight room, on the field, and things like that. So it's a really cool, it's a cool stance for me. And I have a mentor who's also been in the strength conditioning world for 20 plus years, D1 and professional, and just kind of learning from him and how I can use that unique position I'm in to best benefit the athletes. So just always continuously learning and looking to people who have been in the industry for much longer and can tell me what mistakes they made, what they wish they would or wouldn't have done.
Maria, how much does the perception of playing time, maybe not even the reality of playing time, rather than belonging or contribution or being part of a group, seem to color an athlete's experience? And how do you bring an athlete out of that or manage that? Honestly, no one plays as much as they would like, probably, or think they should.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that it probably does affect how much maybe effort they put in. At times they kind of feel a little defeated, and I can kind of recognize that once it gets like middle of the season. I can tell who's a little bit in their head, who's feeling bad about themselves or playing time. So for me, I take that approach like, okay, I have an hour with this athlete in the weight room, so I'm going to make this the best hour of their day. And if you can do that, it can kind of transfer over to games and practices, and it can make them feel a little bit better. Like, oh, I hit a PR on squats today, and it's going to kind of boost their confidence level a little bit as it was affected from lack of playing time, and it kind of helps them grow. But you do start to recognize it even as like an outside coach. You can definitely tell.
And you're able to kind of keep it into that hour of time together to make max effort to show the progress, to make it to show the worthwhileness of it.
Definitely. Because as a strength coach in the weight room, you can't really tell. Like, I don't know who the best athlete is. I don't know who's scoring the most points. I just know who's putting in that work in the weight room.
That's superb. Dr. Piasecki, I'm going to turn to you for a moment, and you didn't get a chance as you were introducing all the other panelists, but tell us a little bit about your vision for culture in sport and your expertise in toxic culture, and how coaches can affect that positively. Can they undo it? Can they recognize it early? Can they prevent it?
No, those are great questions, Bob. And The first thing I want to do is, I guess I'll explain a little bit of my background. So I coached for a very long time. Most recently, I led the Afghanistan National Aquatics programs from 2008 until a year and a half ago, when the Taliban unfortunately took control of the country. Before that, I coached professionally in Bundesliga in Germany. I also played before that, and I used to coach youth sports prior to that. The reason we started culture in sports is, I'd actually like to use Maria's wording, is that we are all human. We're people. We make mistakes. But what we choose to do with those mistakes is the most important. As a coach, am I going to self-reflect? Am I going to think about my choices and my actions and what I say and what I do every day after practice, or even during a practice or a game or a competition? Or am I going to think I'm just the best coach out there and I know exactly what my athletes need, and I'm just not going to listen to any feedback or do any self-reflection? And so ultimately, opening ourselves up as coaches or as administrators or GMs or athletic directors, we need to make sure that we recognize that we are human and our actions positively or negatively impact others, not only in the short term, whether it comes to playing time or focus or abilities in practice, but really it is the short and long-term mental, physical, and emotional health of those athletes. And even assistant coaches and coaches, it just really depends on the level, and support staff. And as far as my experience with toxic culture, I myself have experienced several toxic cultures, but I have my doctorate in leadership, specifically organizational culture, and my dissertation, which is my doctoral research, was on the lived experience of people that are adversely impacted by toxic leadership and organizations.
Well, that makes you an expert on those issues, and we'll probably come back to them. Michael, you're an expert in another area, kind of abusive and problematic cultures, so much so that they're subject to investigation by the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. I was joking earlier that between the two of us, we've probably done more investigations or audits of investigations in the sports space than any two people alive. And certainly when we're together, we probably have done more than almost anyone. Talk a little bit about your work at Safe Sport, and talk a little bit about what that covers, because obviously people in the athletic integrity officer role, like I was, were perceived by coaches as being the enemy. And I often felt that we were the people that could help them, to guide them to a better position by avoiding the pitfalls. And the Center for Safe Sport had a little different purpose, but you were trying to guide organizations in sports, the Olympic governing bodies in the US, to those same goals of positive outcomes. Talk a little bit about your experience. Talk a little bit about how that affected coaches in your world.
Yeah, so I spent close to 3 years at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, helping build up the compliance department, which at the time was working with the national governing bodies in Olympic sports. We were helping them kind of implement the policies and procedures that the U.S. Center for Safe Sport was telling them that they needed to implement, and kind of tying it back to coaches and tying it to culture. Really what that was about, and something we focused on, was helping governing bodies realize, okay, what are the steps and what are the things we can do that protect athletes while still making sports as beneficial as we all, I think everybody on this panel will say sports have a benefit, and that's the reason we're all tied to them. And so in my eyes, and kind of the way I always looked at it, was we need to improve the culture, because I think one of the things you saw, and I got to see this on a daily basis at the center, was after everything that had happened with USA Gymnastics, you saw kind of a dam break when the center opened, and they were getting all of these cases and all of these reports and all of these things that were maybe going on behind the scenes. And it's like, okay, really, did we have a good culture if this was going on, or was it just festering under the surface and it needs to come to light so we can all heal, we can all learn, we can all grow, and we can figure out where the negatives were coming and how we can turn them into positives. And in terms of coaches, in my opinion, the best cultures at any NGB also tended to coincide with coaches who were most willing to participate in and be fully engaged in kind of the safety side of things as well. It wasn't just about performance, it's about every aspect of coaching and protecting athletes, particularly at the center. We're focused on minor athletes, at least in the compliance department. If you're not focused on safety and things like that with the minor athletes, you're kind of setting a bad culture. And I think that that's something I saw all the time. And the best NGBs were the ones that coaches and staff were very engaged on that aspect of things.
That's a perfect scenario. I want to throw out some topics for everybody to kind of jump toward a bit. I came up with about 5 categories of mistakes coaches make, and we'll recognize that as a lawyer, they run between misdemeanor and or violation, misdemeanor, and felony. Not all of them are the most serious. And some of them, like, and as a professor at a Catholic law school, some of them range from venial to mortal sins along that same spectrum. So recognizing that these each aren't a perfect list, but it's a list, and I wanted to get your reaction to them collectively and see if there were additions that you wanted to make. But coaches tend to commit errors, unforced errors, when they use power inappropriately against an athlete. Another area where coaches may potentially make mistakes that can range from being bad to worse when they operate under a discriminatory idea, the idea that they're treating an individual based on a status or a group membership and not individually. When they take up risky practices, things that aren't safe, things that are questionable. I don't know a lot about the case going on at Harvard, and I will trust Harvard to trust their own judgment. But anyone involved in a naked skate in 2023 is probably in a risky zone on that one. It would be highly ill-advised under the idea of safety, sexual abuse, sexualization, and hazing all come into that. And I think the other one that kind of runs this, and this is one where, again, gradation is important to think about. When coaches react reactively and not in a judgment or measured way, and that could run from, like, they caught something and reacted to it, to something where they're always reacting to it and creating a culture that's reactive around it. And then finally, the last, which is hard to really come up with, when a coach acts in an abusive fashion. And by abuse, I'm thinking more Michael's definition in Safe Sport of abuse: physical, mental, emotional, and then sexual abuse of people. Those 5 are the big 5 that I've defined from my practice, and recognizing that if coaches aren't in those zones, they're probably usually pretty good. But I wanted to get your thoughts. Anybody want to just jump in and say, is that a complete list? Are there some things that are clearly missing? Are there things that need to be talked about?
No, I want to go ahead and start out. That's a great list that you brought up, and there's so many different issues and things to think about in each of those categories. But I want to start with something simple, which is overtraining.
And you've been overtrained on that one, Jeremy, unfortunately. Anybody want to pick up on that one? We're waiting.
Some coaches believe, this what was that?
You froze for a moment, Jeremy.
Oh, okay.
So pick up with overtraining.
Yeah, so some coaches think, well, this is how I did it. This is what I'm going to do. For my athletes, this is what's going to be best for the team, and they're going to train, and they're not going to think anything's wrong with it. And then athletes are going to start getting injured. Athletes are going to start losing focus. Athletes are going to start losing their love for the sport. Those are some of the many things that could possibly happen. But if the coach doesn't know that he's overtraining, then is he doing something that's purposely abusive and malicious, or is he just being abusive? On the same side, if an athlete brings it to their coach that they're feeling they're being overtrained, or maybe an assistant coach does, and the coach chooses not to self-reflect and to think about their training practices and what they're doing, that coach in turn, like, she could be very complacent, and it could lead to a very toxic culture once that coach is involved in it. And overtraining doesn't fit into one category. I mean, overtraining basically fits all the categories and many more that you've already mentioned.
I was going to try to categorize it while you were talking, Jeremy, that it comes from one, a risky practice, a hazardous practice to the athlete, but it also can be a reactive process. The idea that I was trained this way, other athletes have trained this way, you need to do it this way, or maybe even power. Maria, this is right in your wheelhouse. How do you work around the idea of using modern science to avoid overtraining and overtaxing athletes?
Yeah, so I think that it is hard to find a good balance between overtraining and also undertraining, because you never want to do too much, and also you don't want to cheat your athletes by not having them do enough. I actually worked with a soccer team, and their coach had this system that I've never seen before, but I absolutely loved it. And she basically would ask their athletes every day, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling soreness wise? And this was during season. And they had that trust where they would be honest with their coach because they want to get better. So they would tell her. And if it was above a certain number, then as a strength coach, she would let me know, and I would do mobility work with them, stretch them out a little more. But if they're feeling good, then I would up the weights a little bit. So that communication with the athletes to the coach, and then the coach to the strength coach, made a huge difference for them. They ended up going undefeated in the season. So obviously they called something was working, but so that system that she did, I think helped a lot. You just have to have that communication and that trust between the athletes and the coaches.
High level of trust, high level of cooperation, sounding like it's not just an individual activity being a coach. You're getting input from a lot of places and trying to judge that. Carl, that's right in your dimension. Are there things that we've left off the list? Are there some things in that list that you want to navigate and maybe play up and or react to Maria and to Jeremy's, what they've said?
Yeah, a couple of things, if I can remember them all. Maria, I love what you just described. I had the pleasure of being around several coaches that operated that way. And what I saw as a best practice, we had a sport performance team where we had the head of strength and conditioning, athletic training, sports medicine, nutrition, performance psychology, clinical psych, et cetera. And we collaborate. Not every coach does this, but some coaches would actually have us all around the table regularly as they're planning out their workloads. And then there's this recognition that no plan survives first contact with life, right? So that you adjust and adapt your plan based on like the rate of perceived exertion, the soreness piece of it, just the fatigue, especially with a student athlete, what's going on outside of sport, et cetera. So that open communication, and I do think it starts with a coach recognizing that they don't have to exert power. They already have it by nature of the title and their job description. So we can take that off the table. They don't have to prove anything to anybody, but the coaches that show themselves open with a growth mindset and want to integrate resources to make best decisions for the overall health and welfare of their athletes, they're going to get more out of the team on a consistent basis. It's more sustainable. A point earlier, recognizing that, generally coaches coach how they were coached. And it doesn't mean that coaches who are of an age that they can be a head coach right now necessarily had been coached by best practices. We learned a lot. That's why we have all these professions and disciplines. And so this idea of recognizing that there's more to learn, and just checking in with a strength coach and an athletic trainer together, because they're partners in this if we do it right, is huge. And the last thing that I'll throw in there is this idea of the reaction to things. That in my military background, and I know Jeremy can connect to this a little bit as well, that we always talk about don't react to the first thing you hear, because information, your first shot at information is rarely accurate and never complete. There's more to the story. So in every situation, if you can lead with curiosity, That's where real critical thinking comes in, right? We're the postponed conclusion, like you're recognizing there's more information out there, and when you see a behavior, there's a reason behind that behavior. We can understand that, and that behavior could be something where somebody's doing something or failing to do something. There's a reason behind it, and if we can pause and be curious and unpack that and check into our left and right, our first response won't be a reaction. It'll be measured, and it'll be intentional, and most likely more effective.
Carl and Jeremy, before I go to Megan with a cultural question on this that kind of plays off what we just said, the military has done a pretty good job, or at least has devoted a lot of attention, and you two have a much deeper knowledge than I do, of eliminating bullying, unhealthy, unproductive cultures and behaviors, maybe is the better word, from their culture. Can you talk a little bit about that and how teams could learn from that process?
I'll let Carl go first.
Okay, sure. I love this question because, and I could go for days and I won't, but generally, let's start with, don't watch Hollywood if you want to know what actually happens in the military. There's very, very few accurate movies out there. There was a shift, and I think it started before my time, but I spent better part of 3 decades in the Army, and saw a lot of transition, and we evolved to a point where you don't have to be yelling at people all the time. You don't have to be making their life miserable all the time. You can actually lead them, right? And when you connect and build authentic relationships and inspire them to go where they may not be able to go on their own, versus demand that they do something or the carrot and stick kind of thing, you can get so much more out of people. If you look at some of the best that the military has to offer, the Army Rangers, the Navy SEALs, the Air Force Special Operations, MARSOC, these people, they don't feel the need to yell at, berate, and demean anybody. They let the conditions and the environment and the task be the stressor. And then they teach them, coach them, mentor them, and lead them. You may hear some things that are pretty demonstrative. You may hear some people that have fiery personalities, but if you listen carefully to what they're saying, it is all challenge and support, inspire, and teach. And I think we can all learn from that.
Megan, that may tee you up, but as somebody who looks at successful culture, or how companies, businesses, sport organizations establish repeatable, sustainable, successful culture, what are the key attributes of that, and how can coaches do a better job at the sustainable part of that culture?
Great. Yeah, I think lots of the tenets have been talked about, but I would hone in on a few. The first one being clarity on strategy. So I think oftentimes, we've talked about today, coaches and those within the sports system are bringing forward what they have seen before, right? What they have received before, what they have seen before. And so I think there's an opportunity in terms of creating a sustainable, healthy culture is to be really clear on what are the high performance levers that you're going to pull? What is really important for the sport that you're in? How do you set up proper training programs, nutritional programs, psychology programs? What do your athletes need? So my advice would be never underestimate that level of planning, that level of strategic thinking, because I think that ultimately allows you to, make a step towards getting out of the reactionary aspects that you mentioned last. And then I'd also say, and Carl talked about this, is like the constant feedback, right? So that strategy is only as good as, the hour it's talked about. Okay, so, how do you put feedback systems in? Is it the 1 to 10? How are we feeling? That's a great practice, but you need to think about feedback, which I think is another way to help you recognize as a coach that feedback is inevitable. So either setting up the practices and the systems to allow that to come to you and allow that to come forward, or it will come forward, right? It's like water will find its cracks. So setting up your feedback practices, your communication practices. The other element that we think is really important is clarity on roles, clarity on responsibilities, clarity on accountabilities, decision makings. we're humans. We like to know how we're going to make impact, what we're accountable for, what our lane is, particularly in the complexity of today's environment. So ensuring you've got clarity on structure. Yeah, spending time with folks, making sure they really understand. I've had the fortune of getting to know a few Navy SEALs, and like, they know what they're up to at all times. And because they know what they're up to, they're able to trust each other. And so I think that's the last part, is how do you as a coach take seriously your role in both the technical high performing aspects of what you're creating in these other humans, but that you're also creating humans. It's a beautiful story, Maria, for you to talk about. At the end of the day, you're impacting a human's life. And so how you show up can really impact them. And so cultures of trust, cultures of communication, cultures of feedback, normalizing those norms, those attributes do wonders. So is that helpful?
I think that's so helpful. It prompts us to take a change in direction. But let's go to Michael and Maria in a little bit of a way. Are there things that are there mistakes that coaches make that we haven't talked about that are out there? And then kind of pivot off and let's bounce back the idea of how do we establish this trust communication culture when we've had bumps or bruises along the way, both practically, culturally, organizationally, and philosophy. And so Michael and Maria, why don't you just jump in as you see fit?
So just go ahead, Maria. Okay. So I think from my perspective, one of the things that you talked about with the 5 is that each of those can then be applied to investigations occurring, reports occurring, things like that. So even building off of what Megan just said, if you have this mistake of not receiving feedback, of not creating that culture of openness and honesty, that's when reports are going to come in. That's when violations are going to potentially occur. But it's also then maybe an opportunity, and I hate to say an investigation is an opportunity for a coach, but sometimes it really is. If you're under investigation, that means something happened where somebody felt like things were bad enough that it needed to be reported to somebody who could potentially take action. And so if you react, or if you try to use your power and authority to influence people, or if you're making all of these mistakes, you can make them even worse by compounding them and committing them again in the middle of an investigation or in the middle of something that is going on once a report is filed. So I think it's one of those things where I don't know if I have any new ones, but what I would say is sometimes the reactionary nature of people and the power and authority and just kind of even just being scared, I think, and a lot of times when a report comes through, will lead people to not just make these mistakes as a coach, but make them in response to what is occurring with reports and investigations, when instead you should use those as opportunities to grow and to learn and to see this clearly is important to my athlete, or otherwise they wouldn't have reported me for doing something that they didn't like. So I don't know if I have any new ones, but I do think investigations highlight the mistakes that you're making if you're making any.
Carl and I were talking about that just yesterday, that sometimes problems in organizational culture are born out of the fact that the reaction to the initial report wasn't equanimous or honest, and immediately shoved aside. Some of the greatest crises are, as we say, are in the cover up, not the act. And so I think that's an important note to make. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll shift mine a little bit, but something that I think that gets overlooked a lot is, coaches focus so much on what the culture of their team has always been. So we've always done things like this. This is the culture. And they try to kind of mold the athletes into fitting into that culture. And they start to forget that athlete comes from their own culture, whether it's the country they come from or the city they come from, things that they've been through, and who they just are as a person. And that can cause a toxic environment for that athlete, and the coach may not even realize it. So kind of suppressing that athlete and who they are is a big mental block for them as well, and can also cause a lot of issues with their performance. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jamal Williams. He is running back for the Lions, and he is just this out there guy. He's himself, but he's a great player. And a lot of coaches may look at him and think, oh, he needs to tone it down. It's too much. But there was an interview where his coach, his running back coach, was like, he is the player that he is because we allow him to be himself. And if you take that heart and that personality away from him, he's not going to have it on the field. And I think a lot of coaches kind of forget about that aspect of things where you really have to let your athletes be themselves and let them bring their own flair and their own personality into your culture, while also putting the cultures together.
And that's really important that you brought that up, Maria. So as a coach, when I was a young coach, I didn't understand this concept, and this really took a lot of self-reflection on myself over the years. It's not my job as a coach to make everyone fit the mold that I set. It's my job as a coach to find what everyone's strengths and weaknesses and capabilities and abilities are and what they like and dislike, and then incorporate that into what we're doing as a team and as an organization. And that's incredibly important for coaches and GMs and athletic directors to think about, even trainers, is what position would they best fit in, and how could we best make them part of the team, and how could we best incorporate their strengths into what it is we're doing, whether it's a practice situation or a game day situation.
I'd love to jump in for a second here too, because I think, especially Maria, when you talk about like we've always done it this way or this is who we are, there's a big difference between, and it's absolutely okay for a coach to say, okay, like here is our standard of performance, or here's my vision for the organization. That's fine. But culture is something a little different, right? Culture is actually, and this is my personal opinion, so it's a bias, but culture is the norms and behaviors and attitudes when nobody's watching. That's what the actual culture is. Everything else is the espoused culture. And when there's a disconnect between espoused culture and the actual culture, we have a problem. And generally, human beings don't buy into something that they don't feel a part of. So great teams, and I've been around some, very, very fortunate to have been around some that actually revisit their culture every year because they realize it's a different team every year as you add and subtract. So they start with, what are some of the best organizations you've ever been a part of in your life, talking about your history. How do we come to consensus around what does that look like for this year's team? Then let's unpack where things could go sideways on us, and how do we put some safeguards in place to protect the culture that we value so much so that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish. And now you've got leaders and athletes, and really in any organization, you got leaders and subordinates or teammates that are now collectively part of the plan for who are we this year. And recognizing that it might look different next year, even if the words are the same. What are the behaviors that really exemplify that? Might be a little different from year to year.
Megan and Michael, I want to draw you in because you both have experience in this space. How does best a coach react when negative reports are made? The invariable idea that someone is upset by a practice, somebody is concerned by a practice. How do you best receive that information, process and react to it in a way that doesn't make your reaction worse?
Michael, do you want to start?
Go ahead if you have something. Yeah.
Where we've seen, the good, the bad, the ugly, perhaps is a frame. Where we've seen this work well is to not react, right? I'm back to your last point, Bob, on, as hard as it is in the moment to not take it personally, to not have to jump in and fix, right? Is to slow down and to not react, and to, as Carl said, try to get as curious as you can, right? So just that personal practice, that personal regulation, I think is really important. And as a leader, as a coach, what might those practices look like in terms of, do you have a a high performance, person you can go to? Can you go to your CEO? Do you have a level of compliance within your organization? Who can you go to get the support necessary to almost hold you from reacting? That would be my first sort of trick. The other piece I think is really important, is back to process. I think it's really important to ensure that you are putting process in place to understand what has happened, what's underneath it. Carl speaking, wonderfully to like the iceberg analogy of culture. You're probably only hearing certain things, but what's really underneath that. And I think a tip there is, depending on the materiality or the severity of the claim, it may not be best for you, the coach, to do that work, right? It may not be helpful for you to go and ask those questions and to get involved. So to think about what needs to be done and who might be in the best position to really help, get underneath as to what's happening. So those are just sort of my two more immediate reactions.
Michael, you led that process. So talk about.
So kind of building off that, when she started talking process, I also thought of one of the things that the center focuses on a lot is that you don't interfere with kind of the investigative process and you let it play out. And I think that kind of builds off of what Megan said, insofar as if you let that play out and you let the information get gathered by somebody who is not you, you can learn more from a third party neutral person doing the investigation and gathering the information. And if you show that you're fully participating yourself and not interfering with others who are participating, you've kind of set, if we're talking about culture and talking about setting the right one, you set the tone of, I'm not going to react and try to control people or try to change the way things are going or interfere in the way this is going to play out. I'm going to let it play out so I can learn, I can grow, and I can do better moving forward. Then you are kind of setting that tone that you can come to me and tell me personally, or if you don't, I will let the process play out. I will participate fully and we'll do things the right way. Bob said it earlier, the cover up sometimes is worse than the crime. And a lot of things I think that happen when reports go through is that immediate reaction, the reaction, the process just aren't there because you're so concerned of, oh, why did this happen? But if you let it play out, you can learn the why, you can get all the information, you can gather it, and you could then move forward. And not every report and every investigation is going to lead to a punishment. Sometimes they need to just lead to changes within the organization or within the team or whatever aspect is being covered. And you move forward and you do better. And everybody is kind of satisfied by that outcome. Not every report needs a punishment. Some reports, I believe we saw at the center, were, I don't like this process and I don't want the coach to get in trouble, but at the same time, this needs to change. And as long as it changes, then we're all moving in the right direction and everybody's happy.
Bob, something to add real quick to what Megan and Michael were just saying, which that is gold. Understanding that human beings under pressure revert to habit. So if you have not, and you is the big you, anybody has not spent time thinking about what is their philosophy towards response versus reaction, the strategic pause, the taking a deep breath and allowing things to unfold. If you have not practiced that type of composure as a leader in your mind before you need it, and I mean not just once, but like everyday recommitment to how you carry yourself as a leader in adversity, it's not going to show up in big moments. So it needs to be ingrained in your DNA by regularly reconnecting to that as being a really important part of who you are.
I wanted to continue with what Megan, Michael, and Carl were all saying. So during my doctoral research, a lot of the times the initial issue, the toxic culture that was forming or the abusive leader, that wasn't the gravest mistake that happened, whether it was an athlete or an employee or a member of the military. What it was the reaction when someone reported it. And it led into targeting, and it led into toxic followers, and it led into a whole group targeting one individual, the one who was sexually harassed, or the person who was being belittled or demeaned or discriminated against, or whatever the case may be. Someone, took the risk and they spoke up because that's what they felt was right and that's what needed to be done. And then all of a sudden they were the sole target of a coach or a team or several top athletes, or whatever it is you want to look at. And like Megan and Michael and Carl, and I know that Maria has seen it herself, or she has coached athletes who have experienced it themselves with other teams, and I know Bob has seen it. It's a very difficult situation for anyone to have the courage to stand up, and then it's the reaction that happens, because again, we are all human, like Maria said and Megan has said, and our feelings get hurt, and we want to, in our own way, make the situation correct. And it's definitely the wrong way of doing it. We have to let the investigative process play out. We have to openly listen to what's happening, self-reflect, and then think of what we could do in the future to guide a better organizational culture.
Maria, I want to go ahead, Megan, go ahead.
Right. I think two important parts there is, Jeremy, I think you've just done a beautiful job of articulating what happens in terms of a coach reacting and therefore setting the stage for the culture to unfold, right? So just to expose the meta of that. And, a couple tools, if we think about those that are listening today, there's some great regulation tools around the ladder of inference, right? Like, how do I go up and down that ladder and have a think about, like, what assumptions am I making? Who's around me? Another tool that we really find helpful is the notion of like thinking fast and thinking slow. So like getting into like slowing down, trying to not let, your old habits take form. So just, if you're in that, those are two helpful tools to like regulate in the moment. Big or small.
That's a superb point, and thank you so much, Maria. I want to come back to you and just shift the with about 10 minutes left, and maybe a little less than that. Shift the topic to a question we haven't gotten to, but everyone has alluded to a degree. You talked about having a mentor as a coach, somebody you could trust in, somebody you could work with and confide in. What are the qualities that you sought out in that mentor? What makes a good mentor? And I want to come then to the panel and kind of get to the idea of how important it is to have that as a coach right now, a sounding board, someone to go to, someone who can give it to you as straight as possible and avoid these pitfalls along the way.
Yeah, so definitely, like you said, it being straight up as possible. He's definitely one of those guys where he has seen everything. He's been through so many things. He's been in this industry for a long time, and I'll ask him like, "How should I handle this?" And he'll ask me, "Well, how do you think you should handle it?" And I'll tell him, and most of the time he'll be like, "That's wrong." So just him being honest and then telling me like, "This is what you should do." There's situations where I may have issues with a head coach. Sometimes as a strength coach, sometimes head coaches do make it difficult for us to do our job. And when that happened, I didn't really know what to do. And immediately I was just kind of like, I almost just want to drop this team. And he's like, as your boss, I don't care if you do that. It's not going to hurt me any. But as your mentor and your friend, I don't think that it would be of benefit to you to do that, because you have to work through these things. And things like that. Like, I'm glad that I have someone who can push me when I don't want to do it, or I may not know what to do, and I can kind of get over that speed bump. So a sounding board or someone just to go to is definitely very important as a coach.
Well, I argued that was your role. Megan, you come into cultures after that, and Michael, you and I follow typically when those things have gone bad. Can you talk about the importance of a mentor or a confidant or someone who can guide or coach you as a yeah.
Bob.
Who is that directed to, Bob? Because you were
Carl or
cutting in and
Megan,
out.
I apologize. Whichever jumps on that one. Yep.
Go for it, Carl.
I was hoping you were going to take the lead on that.
I can actually go first if
Sure.
you want. I know it wasn't
for it,
directed to
Jeremy.
me, but Mentors for me come from all directions. So in my life and in my career as a coach, or in the military, or even when I was conducting my doctoral research, I made sure that I sought out mentors, whether it's for personal or professional reasons, like I've already mentioned. But those mentors could come from people at higher levels. They could come from peers. They could even come from subordinates. The best mentors I've ever had were athletes that I coached, because they know their bodies the best. They know what they like and what they don't like. They know what they're receiving that I'm communicating. I may be communicating something, but it's not being received that way. And so every time I speak with a mentor, I have to lower my shield, or my defenses, and I have to go ahead and listen. But I have to be willing to get those mentors. I have to be willing to listen, and they're the ones who made me the coach, or maybe the better leader, or the better individual or family person, only because of those mentors, because I took the time to lower my defenses and actually hear what they had to say. But most importantly, I opened myself up. I became very vulnerable to listen to what they had to say and to start that discussion.
Yeah, I think my approach is somewhat similar and somewhat different in that I usually, when I'm asked who's the most influential mentor that you've had, or mentors, oftentimes there have been people that actually other people would observe I was the mentor, but I was actually learning. And I think it's a reciprocal learning relationship that you enter into there. I also haven't had very many where we actually used the word mentor. It was very organic, doing life together. I have a handful of people, and from every different walk of life I can think of, that I love to stay connected to, ask questions of, sharpen each other, or just go for a walk or a virtual walk and do coffee. And I use the phrase a lot, but do life together. And that's a model that I brought with me to my most recent job. And it was the most fun thing I've ever done, I think, is doing life with coaches and their staffs, because I was part of the family, they were part of mine, and we were learning from each other every single day. And then there was so many opportunities to share, or say, hey, have you thought about sharing some of what you're doing right now? Because it's amazing. Let's get a bunch of volunteer coaches together, or coaches voluntarily coming together, and just talk with each other and sharpen each other, and realize that we don't always have to have a formal structure. Some formal mentoring structures are wonderful. We don't have to have it.
I don't want to trivialize our time together in any way, but we have about 3 minutes left. And given the title and purpose today, which is to help coaches avoid mistakes, things that they commonly do, can you give us a single recommendation or best practice, and we'll go around the panel. So please feel free to jump in, but I want to hear from everybody in about 30 seconds or less, unfortunately.
I'll volunteer to go first. My guidance and advice would be, don't go alone.
Mine would be vulnerable and open yourself up to listen to others.
Mine would be to continue growing always.
And mine would be leadership and followership, two sides of the exact same coin. Be curious about what you're seeing and open to growth.
Similar to Maria, I would say, don't think negatives have to be negative. Make them a positive and learn from them and grow, and you'll be better off because of it.
The first rule of compliance, in a way. I want to thank our panelists. You guys are amazing, and I hope we've given good value to the coaches and parents and athletes who are listening to us today. I'm absolutely grateful to my relationship with culture and sports and the work that it's doing. Jeremy, I tender the panel and the program back to you for a few final thoughts.
No, this definitely was an amazing discussion about coaches, leadership, and culture. I'd like to thank each of you for your incredible thoughts and contributions to the Culture Roundtable. I'd also like to take the time to thank all the attendees for your desire to be better leaders and have a better culture in your organization. Our next Culture Roundtable is on April 12th at 12 o'clock Eastern, and the title of that is Lessons from COVID-19. And if you'd like to learn more about culture in sports, our different programs, or the Culture Roundtable, please visit us at cultureinsports.com.